Hello, I'm Flavius Mihaies, an independent journalist, and today I have the privilege to returning to the great conversations I had with His Eminence Archbishop Lazar Puhalo, returning here in British Columbia, where His Eminence started the monastery called the All Saints Monastery. And today we will dive back into history and the church in Eastern Europe through the fascinating and personal account of His Eminence relationship with one of the key actors in the transitions of both the geography and the churches in Ukraine in the first half of the last century. Good afternoon, Your Eminence.
Good afternoon.
It's good to be back, and perhaps in just a few words to, if at all possible, to give a brief summary of your career and who you are.
Well, okay, I'm retired Archbishop of the Orthodox Church in America and abbot of All Saints in North America Monastery near Mission City, BC. And I guess I've written a bunch of books and given a lot of lectures, but I suppose that's enough.
Thank you, Your Eminence. It's interesting when we double click on the history of Ukraine and the surrounding region in the first half of the century. The church played a role there, not only the collapse of the empires. The church played a role, and sometimes in a way that is larger than one would think when we study the First World War and the transition between the First and the Second World War, where it's about borders and political entities. Can you tell us a bit more about what happened with the church, with the Eastern Church, with the Catholic Church and the other churches in that story of how Ukraine became what it is today?
Well, Ukraine has been shaped by several forces. It was part of the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth for a while, part of their empire that they had. And that had a big influence on the language as well as on the culture in certain ways. And part of Ukraine was always in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which also had an effect on the culture of that part of Ukraine. The thing is that in the Ukraine, when it was occupied by Polish Lithuanians and the part that was occupied by the Habsburgs, the church, the Orthodox Church was sort of subverted and pushed down, and very often their churches would be taken away from them by the Eastern Rite Catholic churches, and they would have to then rent them in order to have a service. And it was part of the nastiness was that the Jesuits turned over the original Orthodox churches to Jewish landlords, and that was part of the unpleasantness that was created by that circumstance. So anti-Semitism became stronger in Ukraine than any other part of the Russian Empire, but it was almost intentionally done that the people would have to rent their churches from a Jewish landlord.
How did we end up in that situation where the Orthodox Church? Can you maybe break down what happened from?
Well, it was a period of competing empires, and they were trying to take territory. The Ukraine was great farmland, and the Austrians would like to have had it all. The Polish-Lithuanian Empire wanted to stretch to the Black Sea. I mean, they were before the Austro-Hungarians, but a lot of the activities that went on there were from the Teutonic Knights, which were a Catholic military organization. And it caused a great deal of strife and contention among the three empires, but also caused a great deal of contention between the Orthodox Church and the Jewish population. Was almost a created problem, created by the West, and developed quite unpleasantly. So I know when Metropolitan Anthony Khrapovitsky was the Archbishop of the Metropolitan of Kiev, he tried to have to put together an autonomous Ukrainian church.
We are talking about which decades here, which time was that, which century, which?
Oh, the beginning of this century.
So before the
beginning of the 20th century.
Before First World War, just before First World War.
In the era before the First World War.
Why was
and after, during the First World War, you know, Ukraine had a little period of independence when the Soviets didn't manage to take it over right away. And that was the time when Metropolitan Anthony proposed an autonomous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, thinking that the Soviets wouldn't conquer Ukraine, that they would just Great Russia. And so they were kind of preparing for independence from the Soviet Union. But of course, it didn't last long. The Soviets finally took Ukraine. They wanted to take everything that had formerly been part of the Russian Empire. And, you know, in the Caucasus too, Georgia and Azerbaijan and Armenia declared independence, but the Soviets weren't going to have any part of that, so they eventually marched in and took over the Caucasus.
That's about around 1921.
Well, yeah, because in 1917, the original revolution wasn't communist, it was socialist under Kerensky. But then the Bolshevists, which means the majority, Bolshevik, took over the revolution, and then the Civil War was being fought between the various factions. Kerensky, of course, got exiled to Paris, and the Bolsheviks did take over after.
Right.
And then they wanted to keep the Russian Empire intact.
What happened then in 1921 when the Soviet get control of Ukraine and swallow it into the Soviet Empire? What happened with that project of independent Ukrainian church?
Well, the Soviets weren't going to allow that, of course, because they wanted absolute unity in the Soviet Union. Mm-hmm. In 1917, the Russian Church had a Congress and restored the Patriarchate for the Russian Church, and that was the Soviets, well, begrudgingly, but they wanted the whole empire to be under Moscow, and the church itself would have to be directly under Moscow.
At the beginning of the last century and up to 1921, were there other churches than the Orthodox Church in Ukraine at the time?
No, there was the Orthodox Church was dominant because Ukraine was actually a Cossack state, and the Cossacks were generally Orthodox. But there was the tension, especially after the Treaty of Brest, that the Unia were permitted to flourish in that part of Ukraine that was occupied by the Austro-Hungarians. And that's the time when the Orthodox people in the provinces that were governed by Austro-Hungarian Empire were persecuted quite heavily. Sometimes it got to the point where the Orthodox divine liturgy was going on, and then the soldiers would come and barricade the door from the outside and then set the church on fire. The people inside would all be burned to death, couldn't escape. So it got quite nasty in that period of time.
When you mentioned the Treaty of Brest is the late 16th century treaty.
Yeah, that allowed the Uniate to exist.
How would you describe the Uniate Church? The Uniate Church, is that a church of Eastern rituals and traditions, but allegiance to the Pope?
Yeah, they Uniate served exactly like an Orthodox liturgy, had married priests, of course, and they would mention the Pope silently, so the people didn't really catch on. But in many of the churches, they'll commemorate the Pope silently, or in just a whisper or something.
Right. So the Uniate Church what was the relation at the, especially at the beginning of the 20th century? What was the work of the Uniate Church in Ukraine, and what was the relation between the Uniate Church and the Orthodox Church in Ukraine?
Well, the Orthodox, in general, the Orthodox people realized that the Patriarch of Moscow was their patriarch, and that they functioned under that. But when the Uniate Church came in, they actually took away some of the Orthodox churches from the Orthodox people.
By legal or force?
Yeah, by force. And then the Orthodox people could lease or rent some of their churches for divine liturgies. And so they were, at that point, rather anxious for the Russians to come and, protect them from these outsiders. But there was a Ukrainian nationalism at that time also. It was as if they were sort of really divided between two empires, the Austrian and the Russian. And the Germans were out there that much yet. And so the Austrians were trying to create a different Ukrainian culture and language to sort of separate it from Russia. But the church kept them somewhat united because they were under the Russian Patriarchate. And it wasn't until the Soviets conquered most of Russia proper, but they hadn't conquered Ukraine yet, or the Caucasus. So the Ukrainian church was completely cut off from the Patriarchate by the Soviets in the Civil War. And that's when Metropolitan Anthony had proposed an autonomous Ukrainian church to function out from under the Soviets. He also, by the way, helped found perhaps actually did found the Khrapovitsky Russian Orthodox Church. It's another story, though.
Mm-hmm. So. Can you tell us more about Metropolitan Anthony in the later phase, or perhaps the time he was jailed by the Jesuits? Where does it fit into the story here?
This Metropolitan Anthony, when they elected a patriarch for Moscow to restore the Patriarchate, Metropolitan Anthony got 400 and some votes. The number 2 person was Tikhon, who got 30 some votes. So it was overwhelmingly one of Metropolitan Anthony for patriarch. But the thing is, the top 3 candidates, their names are placed on the holy table under the gospel, and usually they would let a child draw the names out, and Tikhon's turned out to have won the lottery and become patriarch. They used to say that it was a good thing that Tikhon won, not Khrapovitsky, because Tikhon was very peaceful and calm and would kind of accept whatever came along. Metropolitan Anthony would have been too fiercely anti-communist, so he wouldn't have kept his mouth shut, and he would have been exterminated quite quickly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but anyway, when he didn't win the election for patriarch, they gave him to be Metropolitan of Kiev, which was considered the mother of Russian cities. So it was especially high rank to be Metropolitan of Kiev. But when the sort of, we usually refer to them as a Petrova faction, the sort of almost fascist type of Ukrainians had formed a military force, and they were, of course, largely Uniats and in charge of, in communion with the Jesuits. And they arrested Metropolitan Anthony and Archbishop of Logos, who later became Archbishop of Paris. And they put them in a Jesuit prison, not a civil prison or a Polish prison, but a Jesuit prison.
Where was that exactly? In Kiev or more in the western part?
In part of Poland.
In part of in Poland, yeah.
So they, you know, the men wanted to keep busy with something, so Metropolitan Anthony wrote his commentary on Dostoevsky from memory in that prison. He had no access to books, but from memory. And Evlogius was looking for something to do, and Metropolitan Anthony suggested he write his memoirs, just sort of keep their minds occupied. There's a little story where the Polish cardinal wanted to meet these two high-ranking Russians, so they were called to the palace, I suppose, the cardinal's palace, and the cardinal came in, and I think it was Metropolitan of Elogius, or Archbishop of Elogius, described it as the little cardinal swished in. And he was quite surprised because Metropolitan Anthony conversed with him in Latin.
Yeah.
And Evlogius couldn't speak Latin, he could speak Polish, so he conversed in Polish, but they were surprised that Khrapovitsky knew Latin so well. But they were eventually, of course, relieved and let to go back. As the communists solidified their control more and more, they went back into the Russian sphere.
So that practice of closing and taking churches away is not new in Ukraine.
No, there was the Unia doing it at first.
Yes. What has the Unia become today? Is that still active, the Unia Church in Ukraine, or has become the Greek?
No, it was the Soviet Germany did all of that.
Yeah.
And then, but now, the Ukrainian sort of autocephalous Orthodox Church, and you'll see the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which is under Moscow Patriarchy technically. There's a strife to de-Russify everything, and so the Ukrainian autocephalous Church has a great following, but it's mostly nationalist, not so much about the faith as about nationalism.
Is it correct to say that the Unia Church, or part of it, evolved into the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, or these are two separate?
No, well, they call the Unia is Greek Catholic.
Okay, so today the Greek Catholic Church in Ukraine, is that the offshoot?
The Ukrainian Catholic.
The offshoot of the Uniat?
That is the Unia.
Right. Yeah.
That is the Unia.
Yeah, and is it active? This church is still active in Ukraine?
Oh yeah, very active. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially in the westernmost provinces.
Yes. Yes. Did Germany have a role into that transition or those events?
Well, not in the beginning, because the German Empire hadn't, frequently the three empires would divide up Poland. Austria had part of it, Russia had part, and the Germans had part of it. But they weren't playing that much of a role at the time of the revolution in it, except that Germany had started, the war was going on already, and Germany, in order to undermine Russia and try to close the Eastern Front so that there wasn't a battle on the Eastern Front, the Kaiser had linen brought back into Russia in a sealed rail car, thinking it would cause confusion and chaos and put Russia out of the war.
Mm-hmm.
So that, at first, that actually worked for a little while. Then as the Russian Empire got its stability, the Soviet Empire got stability, they reopened the war on the Eastern Front.
Why would the Jesuits go as far as jailing Metropolitan Anthony?
Well, because he was the leader of the Orthodox Church there, and he was very much beloved, very popular, and it just had the power of popularity, among other things. But I think the Jesuits saw an opportunity, maybe they could take over the whole of Ukraine at that time.
How has that worked out?
Well, it didn't work too well, but in certain areas in Ukraine, the Uniate Church became dominant. But a lot of the people who were going to church, the simple folk, the peasants, didn't realize that they weren't going to an Orthodox church, because everything was exactly the same except the commemoration of the Pope.
Mm-hmm. 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 And subsequently, after his time in jail, what unfolded for Metropolitan Anthony when he was freed?
Well, when he was liberated, and I think it was probably the Soviets who liberated that portion, he went back and to his see in Kiev. And then when it became clear that the Soviets were going to take the Ukraine, a lot of the church leaders fled further to the south so they could be independent, keep the church running independently of the Soviets. And finally, it became clear the Soviets were going to sweep the whole area. So a lot of the Russians had fled to Constantinople and ultimately to northern Greece. The church organization itself fled to Serbia, and this is well, the language was similar enough, and it was an Orthodox country. So the Metropolitan ended up in Khrapovitsky in Serbia.
Can these events, with the role of the Uniats and the wrestling for control over part of Poland and part of Ukraine, help explain the recent event or the current events in Ukraine?
Well, I think a majority probably of Ukrainians consider themselves not Russian, but a different country. See, in the Russian Empire, that area was called Little Russia, wasn't called Ukraine. And I think it may have even been against the law to refer to it as Ukraine. So the nationalism was already there. So that's it's really kind of a tragedy, because the Metropolitan Anthony and some of the hierarchs had fled down to the shores of the Black Sea, and Metropolitan Anthony was then evacuated by deception. Actually, the Greeks had a church on all their warships and everything. There was a Greek ship in harbor and they asked Metropolitan Anthony to come and serve a Meneban or prayer service on board the ship. And to lure him on board the ship, they said, "Oh, the Greeks have retaken Constantinople, and we want to celebrate together with them as they're going to celebrate to get in the Greek church."
Mm-hmm.
So Metropolitan Anthony come to serve a Meneban, and while he was, they said it would be 2 or 3 hours before the service began. So Metropolitan Anthony should go and rest. And while he was resting, the ship sailed and went to Constantinople. He was evacuated without really intending to be evacuated.
Mm-hmm.
So that's him. You know, Metropolitan Anthony was really an outstanding theologian, and the things that he wrote were always superb. But that sort of anti-Semitic stream flowed through everything in Russia. You know, you had fanatical anti-Semites like, I'm going to speak of his name right now. I think Metropolitan Michael of Moscow was fanatically anti-Semitic. And the Metropolitan Anthony might have had what we call Judeophobia as much as being outright anti-Semitic, because he did try to prevent pogroms in his diocese when he was Bishop of Bodin. And but his disposition toward the Jewish population was negative, and that was remembered. But that was pretty standard for everybody in power in the Russian Empire.
And what made you choose Metropolitan Anthony as a spiritual grandfather? I think we call it one.
Well, the first of all was his work on Dostoevsky, a Russian woman that close friend. Her brother and sister-in-law were close friends of mine, and she had translated Metropolitan Anthony's work on Dostoevsky, and she couldn't get it published, and so they suggested, well, send it to Synaxis Press in the monastery. And we liked it very much. We did publish it, along with Dostoevsky's concept of spiritual rebirth, both of them. And I was very moved by how he wrote about that, and then read a history of him by one of the Metropolitans of the Russian Church. And also I was a good bit under the influence of Archbishop Mihaies of Montreal from the late 60s on. And he was a disciple of Metropolitan Anthony.
Mm-hmm.
So I heard a lot of the stories about Metropolitan Anthony from him and from his former secretary, George Khrapovitsky, was with him in the exile.
Mm-hmm.
And in Serbia. So he had a lot of stories about him, personal reminiscences, which I could gather together, and other information. I wanted to write a biography of him because I was quite impressed by, but one thing that did impress me was his approach to writing about the main dogmas of the church. He looked at them from an existential point of view. And he didn't want to write an exposition of the dogmas. But Immanuel Kant had become very popular among students in Russia. And Immanuel Kant taught that the dogmas of the faith undermine the natural morality of men. So Metropolitan Anthony, to refute that, he wanted to show that the dogmas of the faith underpin our spiritual struggle and salvation, understanding of salvation. That every dogma has a moral basis or moral purpose. He wasn't interested in writing the whole doctrine or dogma out and but he wanted to show the moral basis of the main dogmas. And from his point of view, it's how does the dogma impact your life if you follow it? What existential value does it have to you? How does it change and shape your life? So he was writing about that moral foundation that the main dogmas provided, but he was writing it against Immanuel Kant's teaching.
Against?
Immanuel Kant's teaching.
That's pretty bold. Immanuel Kant has such a aura within philosophy.
Well, he did his big deal among the Russian students. And Metropolitan, his main thrust was Immanuel Kant taught that the dogmas of the faith were a hindrance to natural morality, numinous morality. And Metropolitan said, well, he's thinking about the Latin dogmas, the Western dogmas, because they have no existential value. And he wanted to show that these things impacted your daily life if you were following them. And so that he wrote the moral idea of the main dogmas of the church, which Benedicta Barlam and I translated to English and published at the monastery. Then I did a biography of Metropolitan Anthony. And, well, you know, certainly no one is perfect. But his Judeophobia, I think, was the thing that bothered me the most. That was almost part of the culture in Russia at the time. And but the way he handled his diocese or treated people in his diocese was touching too, because it was said that he never locked his front door in case seminarians traveling between places could always come in and crash on his living room floor. But the samovar was always operating, and he had several samovars in the kitchen. And one archbishop described it as looking like a steam-driven factory with all the samovars boiling away. But there was always tea and something to eat for anyone who came in during the night. That, I can't remember offhand the bishop's name, but one bishop who had been had slandered Metropolitan Anthony and cursed him and really hated him. And when that same bishop was going into the exile along the Black Sea, he said that Metropolitan Anthony greeted him and treated him like a long-lost son, and never shown any bitterness or anger for him having been opposed to the Metropolitan all those years. The contemporaries of Metropolitan Anthony knew Dostoevsky. To what degree, I don't know, but he went to his lectures. And some of the contemporaries of Metropolitan Anthony said that he was the type for Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov. So maybe he was. He was a very diligent monk.
And how has Metropolitan Anthony challenge of Kant withstood the test of time? How has Metropolitan Anthony challenge of Immanuel Kant withstood the test of time?
Well, it was.
How is that?
It was mostly about Kant's declaration that the dogmas were a hindrance to natural morality of people. And that was the main point. And of course, also that Kant was focused on Western doctrines, not Orthodox doctrines. So, things like the heresy of substitutionary sacrifice and the heresy of original sin were part of what he was figuring on. Metropolitan Anthony refuted those two teachings.
And how has that sustained the test of time? How has that?
there was in Metropolitan time there was a group of people. He was just one of several. Were trying to recover patristic theology in the Orthodox Church.
Right.
Because for 300 years, they had actually even taught seminary lessons in Latin, but not Greek. So the theology had become fairly corrupt. And Metropolitan and a few others who are working together with him were trying to restore so the writing wasn't just about the moral idea of the church. It was a refutation of false doctrines from the West.
Yeah.
That's why when we talk about the redemption, we're not talking about a substitutionary sacrifice like the West concocted.
Yeah.
But we're talking about the full conquest of the alienation between the human nature and the divine nature. So, in the first place, in the incarnation of Christ, we see it as a manifestation of God's co-suffering love with mankind. He came down and co-suffered together with mankind in the flesh, but by uniting the divine nature and the human nature in himself, he made liberation from that alienation possible. And we participate in that alienation through and in Jesus Christ. And in that redemption was manifested.
Would you say that the challenge of Kant has been successful? That it offered an Eastern alternative to Kant, or?
Well, it was just a flat critique of Kant's work where it impacted understanding of dogma.
Right.
That was the main thing.
Right, and this is being followed today. That it's being upheld. That criticism.
I suppose it have the same critique. It's just that Immanuel Kant's not nearly so popular as he was at that time, and he was having an impact on the Russian Church. So Metropolitan they wrote about. He didn't necessarily like writing these philosophical works, and one time. Anyway, the Metropolitan, the man who became Metropolitan of North America, and Leonti Turkevich was one of his students. And Turkevich wanted to write something, and Metropolitan Anthony advised him, well, don't write for the intelligentsia, write for common people, because they'll read it and take note of it and try to manifest it in their lives to some degree. But if you write for the intelligentsia, all they'll do is critique the work, but it won't have any impact on their spiritual and moral lives. So he was in a position where he had to write at a little bit of a more philosophical level, because he was the inspector of the seminaries, and later, as Archbishop, he was really head of several seminaries. And he wanted to straighten out the things that were being taught in the seminaries, make sure they were actual Orthodox teachings and not Latin teachings.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why it was so important too, because he was one of the beginners at the foundation of a movement in the Orthodox Church to recover patristic teachings, and instead of just philosophical teachings. And that was, he didn't carry very far because the revolution came, But Romanides and George Flavius and several others were the neo-patristic teachers in the church,
And would you
contemporary with us.
Yes, and so would you say that the patristic teaching has been recovered today?
Yeah, well, it had been to a greater degree. I think it's being undone now at places like St. Vladimir Seminary, where an evangelical group, a convert from evangelicalism, but still very much evangelical in their attitudes, has really taken over St. Vladimir.
Where is that? Where is that?
Seminary? It's the main seminary of the OCA, the Orthodox Church in America, and it's in Syosset, New York. But this ultra right wing, I would call it, movement, the people who had, I'm not saying they openly deny evolution at the seminary, but in general, with evangelical people, they're very hostile to the reality of evolution.
And how is that related to the patristic teaching here?
Well, you can't have a proper anthropology or understanding of mankind if you don't understand evolution. You can have a theological artificial anthropology. And really the essential anthropology for us is that body and soul are together as one entity. And that was something that all the Holy Fathers who refuted Manichaeism and other Gnostic systems, one of the first things they took up was that if you look at the soul of a man, you don't say it's the man, but only a part of the man. And if you look at the body of the man, you don't say that it's the man, but only a part of the man. So body and soul together is our main anthropology. The understandings that come from evolutionary biology are something different. They go much deeper into it. But the thing is, we couldn't have medicine at all unless we had evolutionary biology.
So in that understanding, evolutionary biology is somehow connected to the writings and the thoughts of the church fathers?
Well, I don't think they weren't aware enough of to really make it a big deal. All they wanted to say was the body is not the enemy of the soul, which all the Gnostics taught. That the body was a prison house of the soul, and the soul escaped from it only by death, and that was the completely wrong answer and attitude. So the fathers wouldn't have gone quite so far as to know how to word the evolutionary biology. It wasn't a developed science at the time. You know, there are some things that sort of crept through. Gregory of Nyssa had a very powerful idea about neural inception, which could almost be modern from our own time. So they explored those things, but they didn't have a framework, a greater framework to explore them within.
Right, but in your understanding, today the patristic teaching today includes acceptance, integration of evolutionary biology.
Yeah, the implication was there because medicine was considered a ministry of the church in the beginning.
Sorry, what was?
A ministry of the church.
Yeah.
And the three cousins of Apostle Paul, three women, were the first unmercenary healers who healed without charging. And that was a firm tradition in the church, the unmercenary healers. But when the Byzantine Empire was founded, there was a universal healthcare system, free healthcare system. In fact, in Constantinople, in order to maintain your license to be a doctor, you had to serve 1 month free in a public hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And Basil the Great built a hospital so large that they called it the city of Basil. So that was, and a free universal healthcare system was a part of Constantinople until the fall of the city. So it's right-wing people who see an enmity between universal healthcare systems and piety or faith are completely in the wrong pew, on the wrong seat, because Byzantine Empire did have a universal free healthcare system. So, and that fact gives you, since there were research going on into ailments and diseases and things, then that means that they're looking deeply into the biology of men. But the concept of an evolutionary biology was something that was had not been explored and had no scientific foundation at the time. So they didn't go into that so much as seeing that that illness was physical. I mean, sometimes mental, but physical, and you didn't cure it by casting out demons. You cured it with medical science, and they developed that as much as they could with the equipment that they had. Without microscopes or petri dishes and everything else.
Thank you. If there are concerns today that the patristic teaching is being somewhat undone in seminaries like St. Vladimir, other seminaries where it's not undone, like the other seminaries today, that it is actually thriving in a way that
there's been a considerable recapture of the patristic spirit.
In where?
And in George Pawlowski was teaching at St. Vladimir's in the early part of the last century, and John Romanides was the dean of Holy Cross Greek Seminary
in America.
In America, and they were both deeply concerned with the recovery of patristic theology, and that has rolled on afterwards. So Father John Mayer was recently the dean of St. Vladimir's, was very much interested in restoring it to the realm of the patristics theology.
Is today, where would you say today it is happening?
Well, I mean,
outside America?
Well, there are certain theological writers who are still trying to capture it.
For example?
I'd say that often they're not paid quite enough attention to. Well, Father John Mayer was one of them, but the late Callisto Swear was another one. Callisto Swear in Britain, and he was another one of them. I lectured with him a few times, and he liked to do the epilogue to the series, and I would do the prologue. No, he did the prologue, and I did the epilogue. But he was also keen on recovering. But see, this is a little bit tricky, because we want to have the spirit of the fathers and some foundational teachings, but we realize that we can't be fundamentalists about the Holy Fathers any more than we can be fundamentalists about the Scripture, because the Holy Fathers often, their cosmologies or teachings about the earth and things, they were locked into a time when you had a sort of a knowledge tunnel. That is, you didn't have the equipment or the instruments to know and to tell. It's like disease theory really had to wait until the microscope, and a better version of the microscope was, so you could see these things, bacteria and viruses finally. But until those things were developed, you had no way of knowing these little bacteria were there. You could surmise, but it was easier to think of they were demons instead. But they were really bacteria, so bacteria are demons.
Are there seminaries outside the West, so seminaries in the Slavic world, or Slavic or Eastern world where the patristic teaching is thriving, or it's hard to tell?
There's a good bit of it going on, trying to carry on that recovery. But at the same time, there's kind of a block to it by modern circumstances that some teachers become afraid of. And by fear, they start to shut down.
Afraid of what?
The contemporary world.
Such as?
Well, you know, the West and Protestants in particular had this apocalyptic fantasies, or we properly called eschatological fantasies. You know, about the last day, suddenly all the good people were going to be raptured into the sky, and the bad people were going to be left behind to suffer. But all this is going to take place soon.
But how would that interfere with the patristic theology?
If we look at it, see, the eschatology has become fearful for a lot of people in the West. It's something to be terrified of. But from an Orthodox point of view, eschatology, the end of the world, second coming, are something we look forward to with anticipation and hope and joy as a fulfillment of all God's promises to mankind. So it's not a matter of some people will be raptured, some people left behind. The recapture from some of the mythologies, and a lot of the mythologies were metaphors, but that became hardcore mythologies. But understanding that when we depart from this life, the only thing we come into contact with is the love and glory of Jesus Christ. And our own conscience will be what judges us at this time, because all the memories of the conscience will be called forth. As Apostle Paul said, when the secrets of men's hearts are made known, and the conscience will judge you. The river of fire poured forth from an imagery from Daniel, from the Ancient of Days. The river of fire is, according to St. Basil the Great, both heaven and hell, because it's really the river of fire is really the presence of the love and glory of Jesus Christ. You know, it's like a burning fire, but it acts on your own personal conscience. Your conscience will tell you whether you're on the right or the left of the thing. And the idea that there's a fiery pit where people are going to burn for eternity, no, that's not an Orthodox concept.
So what you say is that
so there's some of that trying to be recovered.
The prevalence of that eschatological Protestant thinking is also permeating or influencing theology outside Protestantism.
Yeah, actually, when I've talked to some Protestants who actually converted at the monastery, they were been talking to me about the substitutionary sacrifice teaching of redemption. And they knew something was desperately wrong with it, but they didn't have another language in which to vocalize it. So Orthodoxy gave them a language, the Holy Fathers gave them a language, so they could free themselves from that very ugly doctrine and become fully participants in the glory of Christ. That's we have something that was a metaphor of the Orthodox Church that got rather out of hand and became, in some of our mystic monastics and things especially, it's called the toll houses. And the toll houses are really a metaphor for your conscience when you depart this life. But the toll houses, you know, you had to go, the demonic hordes would torment you, and you'd be judged for each of your separate sins by the demons, not by Christ, by the demons. And they had the power to keep your soul from getting to Christ for judgment. It is snatched and cast you down to hell. It's the burning fiery pit hell. And that's been something of a pastoral nuisance, because the only thing you're going to encounter is the river of fire, which is the love and glory of Jesus Christ. And that your conscience instantly knows whether it's done these things or not. So, and your conscience will judge you. And of course, we have to believe that there's a way to overcome the final judgment of your soul that way, but we can't really go into that publicly. Anyway, that was something that the Christian revival was fighting against a lot of those things. And John Zazoulis, bishop in Istanbul, Constantinople, I'd say was one of the ones trying to recover patristic teachings. But the most renowned characters in it are George Flavius and John Romanides. Those who did the most.
Thank you. Thank you, Religia, and thank you, Your Eminence, for this conversation. And I am looking forward to share it with a wider audience. Thank you for your time.
Well, and you can at some point